I'm thrilled and honored to be included in the symposium. Thanks to Thoughtworks and the organizers for putting on this event, and all of you for your continued attention. Let me see if I can successfully share my screen. Are you able to hear me and see slides?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. What I want to do with my time is draw out for you from a rather different perspective what I take to be two fundamental challenges to automated scientific discovery. I'm going to call these conceptual inertia and skillful manipulation. And I'll argue with varying degrees of confidence that both of these challenges can be overcome. In order to do that, however, I need to clarify what I mean by automated scientific discovery. Scientific inference encompasses a vast array of specific sorts of inference directed at a variety of aims. I intend to restrict attention specifically to ontology or concept generation, that is to say, the positing of new kinds of objects, properties, or variables, and theory construction. As I understand it, that is the hypothesis of law-like relations among elements of an ontology. And I will focus on these sorts of inferences as directed at the purposes of prediction and control of phenomena. What that means is that I am setting aside or ignoring, for now, explanation and understanding. I should flag that that means what I'm understanding scientific inference or scientific discovery to be, or at least the portion of scientific discovery that I'm carving out, stands in sharp contrast to that described by Professor Clark earlier in the context of the Aristo system. Now, given that sense of the scientific inferences of interest, I can say that automated discovery or automated scientific discovery is the production of novel theories and constituent ontologies that satisfy the particular aims of prediction and control through processes that in principle can be carried out by a machine without human intervention. Given this clarification, I do want to get to these problems of conceptual inertia and skillful manipulation, but it will be useful first to turn our attention to the question of novelty. This has been raised multiple times by participants in the Q&A and in the comments. So let's take a look at the ostensible problem of novelty. There's an old bromide in philosophy of science that there's no mechanical route to novelty. By this, it is often meant something like an algorithm or machine or computer cannot be, take your pick, creative, ambitious, enthusiastic, inspired. And for this reason, no algorithm, machine, computer can produce a novel concept. Well, what exactly is meant by novelty here? With respect to scientific concepts, there are at least two types of novelty we can distinguish. On the one hand, we can be talking about the introduction of concepts that effectively reduce the degrees of freedom in terms of which we describe the world. What I have in mind is, for example, feature selection in machine learning. We go from some high-dimensional representation of the phenomena of interest to a efficient lower-dimensional representation. That is to say, we identify some typically non-invertible function of our original set of variables that is maximally informative or efficiently informative about what it is we want to predict. Similarly, the work of Chalupka, Perona, and Eberhardt at Caltech on causal macro variables provides an algorithm for going from some high-dimensional representation of a set of ostensible causes and effects and reduces these to a single pair of variables, the values of which are provably retain maximum causal information about how you can manipulate the effect given this new single macro causal variable. At any rate, what these sorts of new concepts do is reduce the dimensions in terms of which we describe phenomena. The other sort of novelty, and the one that is typically the focus of the complaint about the impossibility of algorithmic novelty, involves introducing concepts that increase the degrees of freedom in terms of which we describe the world. Think, for example, of the introduction of the notion of temperature or atmospheric pressure or color charges in chromodynamics. These concepts expanded on the face of it the degrees of freedom in terms of which we might specify how the world is configured. They increased our stock of properties and enriched our descriptions. Now, despite the old bromide, it's just not true that novelty in the second sense cannot be generated algorithmically. In fact, counterexamples have existed since at least the late 80s. Professor King already mentioned the Bacon program produced by Pat Langley as his dissertation work under Herb Simon at Carnegie Mellon. I want to focus on one specific variant of that program, Bacon 4, and take a look at, in some detail, its algorithm for introducing new intrinsic properties. So the table I'm showing here is data that they presented in their book. And you are to imagine yourself as Ohm in his laboratory with a collection of batteries and wires that can be qualitatively distinguished one from another, and the ability to measure one single quantitative variable, namely current. So we imagine taking our first battery A and connecting it to a series of distinct wires X, Y, and Z. Then we measure the current that results in the circuit. Now, what the Bacon 4 algorithm does with data like this is notice that there is variation in the one quantitative variable we possess across qualitatively distinct contexts, namely wires X, Y, and Z. When it sees that variation, it introduces a new intrinsic property hypothesized to belong to the wires that explains this variation. And it does so in a quantitative fashion. In particular, it simply assigns quantitative values to the new intrinsic variable that match the original values of the variable that it saw varying across the context. Now that means, of course, that when it introduces a new intrinsic property, there's a trivial relationship between the new property and the old. Namely, they're linearly related with a slope of 1. But the hypothesis is not vacuous, because it is the supposition that this new intrinsic property that I've labeled conductance on that column applies to wires X, Y, and Z regardless of their context. So when we introduce new contexts involving the same wires, in particular, we connect them to a different battery B, we assign them the same values of conductance. However, when we do the experiment in the lab here and we notice that the current varies from wire to wire, we notice that it's not the same as before. There is still a linear relationship between our posited intrinsic property conductance and current, but the slope is now different. So what we have in this case is variation of the relation between variables across different experimental contexts. This again causes the algorithm to posit another intrinsic variable, one that we would recognize as voltage. Now, that's about as far as the algorithm can get with this sort of data. We might look at a third battery and obtain a value of voltage, but until we introduce new contexts in which the voltage might play an interesting role, we can't go any further than a sort of constructive relation between voltage, current, and conductance. But you can see that at the very least, we have systematically introduced new intrinsic variables, that is to say, new concepts that expand or increase the degrees of freedom in terms of which we can describe the phenomena in our laboratory. The Bacon algorithm is really an instance of a recipe provided by the psychologist W.W. Rozeboom that he calls ontological induction. In a nutshell, and doing some violence to the subtle logic involved, Rozeboom says that when the pattern of covariation among a set of variables in one context varies across different contexts, we are compelled to introduce a novel variable, the values of which account for this variation. If the patterns of covariation of this new introduced variable again vary across some class of contexts, we're compelled to introduce yet another variable of a higher logical type, and so on. Importantly, each variable introduction is done algorithmically with ready-made connections to previous variables. There's no unanalyzable spark of inspiration involved. That said, Rozeboom's analysis of ontological induction left open an important question. For what classes of phenomena should we consider variation significant? In other words, what collections of physical systems are plausible candidates for being law-governed or sharing a common scientific law in the first place? Right? We don't want to lump together arbitrarily varying systems. The relation between current and temperature in a chemical cell battery it varies or differs from that in, say, a cell membrane, but we would search in vain for a common dynamical description of the two. So how do we cluster together phenomena? And to his credit, Rozeboom noted this question. How do we cluster together phenomena in such a way that we are justified in paying attention to that variation and introduce intrinsic properties that are likely to play a law-like causal role? One answer to that question comes from the theory of dynamical kinds, and this theory is predicated on the notion of a dynamical symmetry. Roughly speaking, a dynamical symmetry is an intervention on one or more variables of a system. That is to say, it's something that you can do to the system that commutes with the time evolution of that system. So it's something you can do, and it makes no difference whether you intervene, let the system evolve, or let the system evolve and then intervene. You end up in the same state of affairs. Dynamical symmetries pick out dynamical kinds. A dynamical kind is a class of causal systems that share a set of dynamical symmetries and for which those symmetries compose in the same way. In other words, it's a way of picking out equivalence classes of causal structure. Membership in a dynamical kind is a sort of causal similarity. And it's that causal similarity that provides the guarantee or warrant that Rozeboom was missing. It guarantees that though there is variation across the class, we are likely to have a common law-like relation amongst the variables describing systems in that class. And so then it makes sense to attend to the variation and introduce novel variables in the way Rozeboom suggested. The Eugene algorithms that my group works on allow sameness of dynamical kind to be determined directly from data on system evolution. Let me give you a concrete example. So consider the case of fluids flowing through soils. We constructed an apparatus involving a vertical column that allowed us to add various quantities of different soils and introduce water from the top of the column. We could also variably pressurize the air gap between the water and the top of the column, and so arrange for different pressure heads on the fluid as it moves through the soil. And what we were measuring is the volume of exuded fluid as a function of time. This system was built as a concrete experimental test of the Eugene algorithms. And what you can find, shown here in the upper plot, is perhaps unsurprisingly for different soils, say a garden soil versus a sand or a heavy clay mixture, you get very different flow behavior. Flow can be rapid and drain the column quickly, or it can take a great deal of time. It's also the case that changing the pressure head changes the way that the fluid, the water, moves through any particular choice of soil. So the data you're looking at here is given for the same type of soil, sand, under different settings of the pump RPM. Now, these different behaviors all turn out to demonstrably belong to the same dynamical kind. That is to say, each realization of the system with a different setting on the pump results in different particular flow profiles, but all of these realizations of this kind of water-soil system belong to the same dynamical kind, and thus warrant taking variation across that kind seriously. In fact, there's a straightforward way to quantify that variation. And what you have down here is a linear scale derived from the variation in flow profiles here. That linear scale happens to correspond exactly to the notion of pressure. So this example is relatively trivial, but it demonstrates the reinvention, in this case, of a scientifically salient, novel intrinsic property, namely atmospheric pressure, or in this case, gauge pressure. So what's the problem with novelty? Right? Rozeboom's recipe, as well as the Bacon and Eugene algorithms, are proof by demonstration that novel concepts can be generated algorithmically, novel in the second sense. And yet, generation of novel scientific concepts is still often taken to be algorithmically inaccessible, an act of creativity that somehow cannot be mimicked by an algorithmic process. Why is this the case? I want to suggest that the reason is the widespread but implicit adoption of the notion of the thesis of conceptual inertia. To draw out both the thesis and why it stands in the way of algorithmic discovery, I actually want to point to a seminal paper in automated scientific discovery. So this is a figure from Schmidt and Lipson's 2009 paper in Science, where they demonstrated a system for ascertaining analytic expressions of laws from time series data. And the sort of laws that they're looking for are invariants of the motion. That is to say, functions of the dynamical variables that don't change over time, such as, for example, the Lagrangian or the total momentum. The details of how the system works are not particularly salient to us. It uses a process they call, it's a genetic algorithm they call symbolic regression. But the point is that it takes in data on, say, the position of bobs in a double pendulum, the position of the masses in a double pendulum, and it searches for invariants of the motion. And what it spits out is not a single unique invariant, but rather a Pareto front of candidate laws that trade off predictive ability, in this case, the ability to predict the values of partial derivatives of the dynamical variables as a function of time, against parsimony, so how complex the mathematical expression is. This, again, is a figure from that same paper. And you see that the authors have boxed two expressions. One of them is the Lagrangian for the double pendulum, and the other is the total momentum. What I want to draw attention to are these candidate expressions. Now, absolutely, I concede that there are reasons to suspect that perhaps these are spurious constants of the motion or invariants of the motion for a variety of reasons. They may be mere approximations. They may ultimately be trivial in one sense or another. But what I want to stress is that one of the principal reasons that those expressions were ignored in the study is that they did not obviously replicate any of the invariants of the motion that a physicist sitting down with pencil and paper to describe this system would have introduced. In other words, they don't have an obvious interpretation in terms of well-known physical concepts. This reflects, however weakly, this thesis of conceptual inertia with which I'm concerned. This is the thesis that new scientific concepts, the novelty that we're looking for, must closely resemble existing concepts or transparently relate to those concepts. You have to tell me what it has to do with well-established, say, in this case, physical invariants of the motion. Well, this is a problem then, or seemed to be a problem for algorithmic discovery, because to succeed at discovery, an algorithm has to produce novel concepts, and yet that novelty is highly constrained. Those concepts must, to a human interpreter, be related in intelligible ways to existing concepts. Since this pair of constraints has proven resistant to algorithmic solution, we worry that, in fact, it can't be done. Novel theory invention remains a challenge for automated discovery. I want to suggest that the thesis of conceptual inertia is misguided. And to do that, I want to present to you three arguments that might justify conceptual inertia in the first place. One is that conceptual inertia is necessary for new theories to be intelligible. I'm going to set that one aside because I've already indicated that I'm not concerned with with satisfying the aim of understanding. So I will set aside the worries over intelligibility. That leaves two other concerns. The first is that science is cumulative, and an algorithm that's not making use of existing knowledge is wasting time. And the third is that an algorithm that fails to produce known concepts, that fails to, as I gave you in my simple Eugene example, that fails to reproduce, to reinvent known concepts, is somehow doing something wrong. Let me take those last two one at a time. First, the argument from prior knowledge. Absolutely, failing to make use of existing knowledge would be a titanic waste of resources. However, the fact that one must make use of prior knowledge does not entail conceptual inertia. That is to say, what an algorithm does with existing knowledge need not resemble what a human would do with that knowledge. So any novelty introduced is not, in any sense, constrained by the demand that we leverage existing scientific knowledge. Well, how could we represent existing knowledge in a way that doesn't implicitly impose such a constraint? I will briefly suggest that the way forward is to frame laws in terms of variables with operational definitions, or variables that are explicitly constructed out of such variables. And to eschew theoretical concepts that ostensibly carry content beyond one. Now, this may sound strongly empirical, and it is, but this suffices for Rozeboom's recipe. It seems to be all that is required for the aims of prediction and control. So what then of the argument from scientific convergence? This idea that if you're not rediscovering in a given domain concepts that look like the concepts we currently use to describe that domain, you're making some sort of mistake. Well, there are two possibilities to consider. In one possibility, science is highly canalized. That is to say, no matter where you start, no matter what set of concepts you begin with in your pre-scientific descriptions of the world around you, we expect to end up in the same place with more or less the same ontology, right? Where we start science all over again and a different group of early practitioners focused on a different set of properties or variables, if you like, and we would nonetheless arrive at sciences that look more or less like they currently do. That is to say, with the same set of concepts, right? So my metaphor on the right here is a funnel, a caldera that forces us down to the same ontology. Alternatively, there may be distinct or alternative schemes that are equally or more competent at prediction and control than the ontologies that we have as an historical accident. The final set of concepts in this view of the scientific enterprise depends heavily on where you begin. If scientific inquiry is not strongly canalized, if where you end up depends on where you begin, then failing to reproduce existing theories is not necessarily a failure. Dropping the dubious premise then of the strong canalization of scientific inquiry makes conceptual inertia unmotivated. In other words, the way to meet that challenge is to recognize that it's predicated on an assumption that should really be a hypothesis open to examination, namely that science is strongly canalized. When we recognize the hypothetical status of that assertion, the motivation for conceptual inertia, at least insofar as we're concerned with prediction and control, evaporates. That leaves, however, what I take to be a far more serious challenge, that of skillful manipulation. I have a figure here from Professor King's paper that introduced the world to the groundbreaking atom system. And I'm bringing this up in order to pull out one very small comment at the end of that paper. So the atom system, of course, carried out the series of experiments for testing the functional genomic hypotheses with which it was concerned. But in carrying out those experiments, they noted that transfer of plates from the robot to the incubator, from the incubator to the plate reader, was done manually. Why was that the case? Well, in part because it is difficult to get robots, even the size of Adam, to undertake all of the sorts of physical manipulations of the environment that a human being can do reliably. What automated discovery requires is that and more. We need the discoverer, we need the investigator to be able to recognize and reliably realize a variety of experimental contexts. That involves both sensory richness, right? A rich set of foundational variables in which to characterize contexts, and the ability to skillfully intervene in the world. But we also need the experimenter to be able to achieve a consistent pattern of covariation between variables before variations in this relation can be detected in the first place. That requires a particular skillful manipulation. It requires a continuous, nuanced, goal-directed, but open-ended interaction between the investigator and the physical world. Returning to my water and soil system, for example, identifying variation in the robust relationship between time and exuded volume required a particular sort of open-ended manipulation. I, standing there at the apparatus, had to try not just different soils, but degrees of compaction, modes of loading the soil into the column, mechanisms for preventing soil leakage into the water outlet. I had to experiment with different volumes of soil, water, and water in our particular apparatus to ensure that we stayed within our sensor range for measuring fluid flow, and myriad other such configurations. In other words, there is a process going on here that is often ignored even by philosophers of science who elevate experiment in their analysis of the scientific process. There is a process of sort of negotiation with the world that takes place in order to get the kinds of stable patterns that you need to feed into the remainder of your discovery algorithm. Again, I really want to emphasize the distinct nature of this challenge. So in a recent paper from OpenAI, they note that building robots that are as versatile as humans, and they mean this in the sense of physical interaction with the world, remains a grand challenge of robotics, right? So here actually is a picture from DARPA's grand challenge in robotics. Getting robots to manipulate anything in a messy real-world environment is hard. In fact, quite a few of the competitors in the competition that photograph derives from not only failed to rotate the wheel they're trying to turn there, but failed to stay upright in the process. What I'm saying is that this challenge has the difficulty that it does because the goal remains poorly characterized. It's not just that we're asking the robot to, say, turn a wheel counterclockwise one full turn. It's not just that we're asking the robot to, say, move assay trays from an incubator to another location. It's that we're asking, or we're requiring implicitly in our discovery algorithms, that someone keep adjusting the objects before them until you get a stable pattern of behavior. We need the machine to engage in the right sort of dynamical interaction with the environment until a repeatable pattern of behavior can be evoked. And we need it to do that without anyone knowing in advance what stable patterns are even possible. In other words, this is much a problem for characterizing or fully characterizing the algorithm of discovery as it is for implementing it in silico. A truly fully autonomous discovery algorithm is as much physical as it is logical. Now, I suggested that this was defeasible, and I believe that to be the case. I suspect that in the long run, there will be progress. There is already progress being made toward characterizing exactly the nature of this interaction that needs to take place, characterizing it sufficiently precisely to implement it as an algorithm in a computer. At the same time, of course, that grand challenge of robotics remains a major focus of research. And the machines, that DARPA grand challenge was an era ago in terms of the agility and stability of robots that can interact with open environments. So I am hopeful that this challenge can be met directly. But that's only a hope. In the short run, it does appear to me to be the case that there is a stopgap measure. There is a way to undertake algorithmic discovery that's just not quite fully automated in the sense of implemented in a machine. The idea is human assistance. So Harshal Hayat-Nagarkar, one of the architects of this event, has promoted the idea of human-assisted AI. That is to say, the use of human judgment to overcome biases, mitigate misclassifications, evolve contextual heuristics, and identify blind spots in our machine learning algorithms. I want to suggest that something very similar to Harshal's idea applies in this case, and advocate for human-assisted automated discovery. The use of skillful human manipulation of physical systems to recognize and realize distinct but stable experimental contexts, ensure experimental configurations with repeatable variation, and carry out interventions in support of a discovery algorithm. In other words, I'm advocating the immediate possibility, not of AI-assisted human discovery, but human-assisted discovery by artificial intelligence. We're the hands, we're the machine, as it were, in this particular dyad. So in conclusion, I want to stress that novel scientific concepts in either sense can in fact be generated algorithmically, and that the challenge of conceptual inertia can be overcome simply by treating the canalization of science as a hypothesis rather than a premise, right? And allowing our algorithms to explore the landscape of possible laws unfettered by human concepts or capacities for understanding. But I do think that the greatest remaining challenge to building a fully autonomous robot scientist is the absence of a clear understanding of skillful manipulation. Thank you for, I do want to say that in the interim, despite the difficulty of that last challenge, algorithmic discovery is possible with human assistance. Now, thank you for your time and attention, and thanks to the US NSF for supporting the research I described here.